In 1989, the industrial growth in the American state of Indiana allowed certain businesses to reach unprecedented heights, with businessmen reaping the benefits. John Parker was one of them. John started working at a very young age. As a teenager, he took a job at a restaurant clearing dishes from tables. However, this was not enough for the ambitious young man, and he ventured into selling vacuum cleaners. Going door-to-door selling vacuum cleaners doesn't usually earn much. Even his own family mocked John's choice. The laughter stopped when, just a few months later, the 19-year-old broke all sales records. It seemed like he went from nothing to a super successful person overnight, but that wasn't the case. John worked tirelessly for his goals, putting in 12 to 16 hours a day. Despite his hard work, he wasn't selfish and willingly shared his knowledge and experience to inspire colleagues to excel in their work. Confident and very charismatic, the young man moved to Michigan, where he opened his own vacuum cleaner sales center. The wave of success brought 20-year-old Judy Hicks to his shore. Judy was self-assured and assertive, but she had to be. Unlike John, who grew up in a middle-class family, Judy knew poverty. She married very young and became a mother of 2 children, Christina and Danny. However, her married life didn't work out, and after the divorce, to make ends meet and take care of her children, she also decided to start selling vacuum cleaners. John helped her, first as a colleague, then as a lover. The closer they became, the more successful the business developed. Judy became his right-hand woman. Every time he gave a speech, John started by saying he wouldn't have achieved anything without Judy. The couple married at the end of 1992 and opened a training center for other sales professionals, J&J Parker Industries. By the age of 30, John became a millionaire, and his family grew with 2 more daughters, Tiffany and Erica. Christina and Danny also called John their dad, spent a lot of time at the office with their parents, and it was impossible to tell that John wasn't the biological father of the older children. The family led a deliberately luxurious lifestyle. This was one of John's philosophies, to radiate success so that his employees would also strive for success. He was an idol of the youth of that generation. However, after 10 years of marriage, many things changed. John, once a cheerful and content man, turned into a bundle of nerves. However, not without reason. His wife cheated on him with their colleague. John became suspicious and installed several surveillance cameras at work, which confirmed his wife's affair. It was a severe blow to his ego. He started drinking. Judy begged him to hand over the incriminating video, but John refused. It would give him a significant advantage in divorce proceedings. However, he had no intention of divorcing. As he jokingly told a friend, "It's cheaper to keep her," so John decided to take his wife as far away from her lover as possible. The family returned to Indiana and settled in the prestigious neighborhood of Crown Point. John opened an office in Merrillville, Indiana, and disbanded the office staff in Michigan. He brought with him only his most loyal employees, including his trusted confidant, Ben. John brought Ben from Michigan and began training him in everything so that when he decided to step back from business, it would continue to thrive. Together, they built a business empire and seemed to be living better than they could have ever imagined. However, on Thursday, April 17, 2003, the emergency services received 2 calls reporting an armed attack in the warehouse district where John Parker's company office was located. The calls came from John's wife, Judy Parker, and his manager, Ben. When the police arrived, they first searched the entire area, including dumpsters and rooftops, in case the suspect was hiding somewhere. Finding no one, they returned to the crime scene and to John Parker, as he turned out to be the victim. His car was parked in front of the office, and he was found lying on the ground with a single bullet hole in the back of his head. The gunshot wound was fatal. A casing from a .25 caliber semi-automatic pistol was found nearby the body. What surprised investigators was that a second identical casing was found some distance away from the victim. The man's wallet was missing from his pocket, and at first glance, it appeared to be a botched robbery. While the medical examiner took the body for autopsy, investigators had to find out from Ben and Judy what they had seen. In Judy's account, she behaved unusually calmly, which the detectives attributed to shock. She explained that in the evening, she and her husband had dinner at a local restaurant while their 4 children stayed home watching a movie. One of their younger daughters, Tiffany, had been misbehaving at school, and the couple wanted to discuss discipline for her. The next day was the start of spring break, so it was clear the girl would be spending all her days at home. At some point, their daughter Christina called and said that Tiffany had left her homework in the office, so the couple stopped by to pick it up. While John exchanged a few words with Ben, Judy retrieved their daughter's work and went back to the car. The couple intended to pass some leftover food from the restaurant to Ben. John walked over to the car and opened the rear passenger door behind the driver's seat. Judy saw her husband open the car door, and almost immediately, 2 loud bangs rang out. She ducked down, and when she looked up, she saw John fall, and a person dressed all in black quickly running away from the car. It was dark, and she couldn't make out who it was. This story puzzled the detectives. Typically, a robber rarely shoots the victim immediately. Usually, there's a short conversation that escalates before it comes to gunfire, but not this time. They suspected it wasn't a botched robbery. Furthermore, besides the wallet, John was wearing a Rolex watch and other valuable men's jewelry. Judy mentioned that her husband, as a businessman, often had conflicts with other people. He was very demanding of himself and his colleagues. About 3 weeks before the murder, he had a heated argument with a former employee right in the office parking lot. The men exchanged harsh words, and police intervention was required to separate them. Company manager Ben confirmed that such an argument took place. John accused the former employee of not returning all the equipment after his departure. The employee, in turn, believed that he hadn't received all the owed payment. However, everything was resolved. The employee returned the equipment and received the appropriate payment. This turned out to be a dead-end lead that didn't lead anywhere. John was killed on a Thursday evening. However, the previous Monday, a school officer from Crown Point contacted the Merrillville police. He learned about the murder from the news and wanted to share important information. For about 6 months, he had known about a conspiracy to murder John Parker involving 3 teenagers. 2 of them were caught with a large sum of cash. The school became suspicious of how 15-year-old students had such a large sum of money, so they questioned them. Although they were interviewed separately, their stories completely matched. They told of their classmate Danny, John Parker's stepson, paying them to kill his stepfather. The seized money was only part of the sum. In reality, they received several $1,000s. However, they deceived Danny, having no intention of even coming close to his stepfather. Since the boys had no intention of committing murder, the school simply confiscated the money and did not pursue the matter further. They didn't even contact Danny's parents or interview him about the incident. Yet, this was an opportunity to learn more about the issues clearly evident in the family. Now, 6 months later, John was dead, murdered, and the police had to determine whether his stepson could be involved. Investigators began interviewing family members, friends, and neighbors of John. The overall impression was that he was an excellent boss and friend, well-liked despite being quite strict and having a volatile temper. John worked very hard but spent every evening with his family. However, it became increasingly difficult for him to keep track of his teenage children, 17-year-old Christina and 15-year-old Danny. Little Christina was simply a wonderful child, but when her mother married John and she was plunged into a world of newfound financial possibilities, all the girl wanted to do was party, enjoy life, and throw parties in their new big house. Soon, she started getting into trouble. Her younger brother Danny wasn't far behind. He was generally more spirited and restless than his sister, and his antics were accordingly mischievous. One evening, without permission and without a driver's license, he took his father's SUV and knocked over mailboxes of neighbors. After that, John had to go around to all of them and negotiate so they wouldn't report his stepson's actions to the police. It's worth noting that John himself grew up in a family with very strict rules and tried to impose similar rules on his family so that the older children wouldn't get into trouble with the law. Of course, the teenagers didn't like this and rebelled. And what about Judy? She preferred to be a friend rather than a mother to Christina and Danny. The parents seemed to be clearly divided into good and bad cops. What was most horrifying was that the younger girls saw the atmosphere in the house unfold and also didn't listen. After learning about the family situation, investigators hurried even more to find the 2 classmates of Danny and interview him himself. Danny did not deny conflicts with his stepfather, who tried to raise him as best he could. He admitted to giving money to his classmates, but not to kill John, just to scare and beat him up. And he had the money simply because he had been saving it for some time. Danny was still detained, and detectives had to find out if 2 teenagers accidentally killed John while trying to scare him. It turned out that one of the boys was in prison on the day of the murder, and the other lived in Las Vegas with his grandmother. Detectives went to Vegas and spoke with the teenager. He insisted that Danny had tried to persuade someone to actually kill his stepfather. But he and his friend tricked Danny and took the money without intending to commit murder. Police confirmed that the boy was in Vegas on April 17th, so this turned out to be another dead end. Danny was released home. Meanwhile, John's farewell took place. The man himself liked to repeat that people would forget your name, forget what you said, but they would not forget the feelings you evoked in them. At his funeral, everyone remembered what a wonderful person he was and how positively he influenced those around him. But someone directly stated that the worst part wasn't that John lay in a coffin, but that the person responsible for his death was probably in the same building with them. It was an unpleasant, oppressive feeling shared by everyone. But a week later, the image of the perfect family took another hit when a colleague of John's revealed a new lead, this time involving his stepdaughter, 17-year-old Christina. An employee of J&J Parker Industries disclosed that Christina, who also worked in her parents' company, approached him to find a hitman to kill her stepfather. For her troubles, she gave him $100 and handed over an additional $500 as a down payment for the hitman. Incredibly, this was another plot to kill John, which ended with Christina being deceived once again. However, suspicion now fell not only on Danny, but also on Christina. The girl denied everything, claiming she simply complained to her colleague about her stepfather, and he misunderstood her. Without details from Christina regarding the money exchange, investigators again hit a dead end. Was this a coincidence? Or had the teenagers conspired and were hiding a much darker plan? Several weeks later, a month after John Parker's murder, the police stumbled upon another lead leading to Christina's classmates. Under pressure, they confessed to selling a weapon to Christina that was used for shooting practice on a family farm. Officers found a tree with bullet marks on the farm, and on the ground, they discovered casings. Ballistics analysis confirmed that the casings matched those found at the crime scene. Now the police could link Christina to the purchase of the weapon, but the girl simply denied everything. And since the police didn't have the murder weapon in hand, and Christina had an alibi, she was watching a movie at home with her younger sisters. They couldn't prove that she killed John. So who pulled the trigger? The circle narrowed around family members, but for the prosecutor, it wasn't enough. There was only a conspiracy, but no weapon, and no person to pin it on. Meanwhile, without John, his family and business gradually fell apart. Judy spent all her time with her new boyfriend Ben, John's right-hand man. The children were forced to take care of themselves, cooking and cleaning the house. This spoke volumes because after a tragedy, a parent instinctively seeks to spend more time with their children. Judy did just the opposite, indicating she wasn't truly attached to her husband or children. The business also declined, and Judy and the children struggled financially. Judy was supposed to receive $1 million from 2 of John's insurance policies, but because the investigation was ongoing, the insurance company refused to pay her. Judy and Ben moved with the younger girls to Michigan. Danny and his biological father went to Arizona, where the boy found work on a construction site. Christina, expecting her first child, stayed in Indiana with her boyfriend Eric. Only John's close friends and family continued to push for the investigation to continue, which it did without ceasing. In 2007, 4 years after John's murder, a detective from the narcotics department contacted one of the investigators on the case. He informed them that Christina's husband, Eric Grabsky, was involved in a drug-related investigation, and there was already a warrant out for his arrest. Detectives seized the opportunity to glean new information about the old case. They speculated that the hope of a deal with the prosecution would loosen Eric's tongue, and they were not wrong. Eric knew who killed John. The triggerman turned out to be Christina's younger brother, Danny. The question was whether Christina would confirm her husband's words. Eric called her and she agreed to come to the station. She stated that her stepbrother Danny had killed her stepfather. However, initially she tried to downplay her role, minimizing her involvement in the case. But investigators had already determined that she purchased the weapon, and it was she who called her parents about her sister's homework, even though school holidays, including Easter, were starting the next day, so there was no rush to collect Tiffany's homework. Therefore, detectives knew that Christina played an active role in the murder. They pressured her, and she confessed that she knew about all the conspiracies to kill John. She, her brother, and her mother had spent over a year trying to find someone willing to kill John, spending several $1,000s on their search. But after multiple unsuccessful attempts with incompetent contractors, they decided that Danny would do it. Detectives flew to Arizona, where Danny lived and worked. When an investigator approached him and mentioned being from Merrillville, Danny visibly softened. The detective asked, "Do you know why I'm here?" To which Danny replied, "I'm ready to tell everything." It was clear that this weighed heavily on him, and he regretted what had happened. Here's what he revealed. The murder of John was Judy's plan. She constantly told the children that she couldn't live with John anymore, that he mistreated her and was abusive. However, when Danny was asked if he ever witnessed such behavior towards his mother, he couldn't recall anything of the sort. Moreover, the police never responded to the family's address. Also, the mother promised the older children that life would be much better without John. They would have money and no control from a strict stepfather who demanded that the children study well and behave properly. Initially, Judy attempted to poison her husband personally, but she failed. Then she and the children began looking for someone willing to carry out this job for money. However, finding a killer and buying a weapon required money. To secretly obtain such large sums from her husband, Judy forged company checks. She stole $7,500, and John was about to find out about it. Ultimately, Judy decided they would do everything themselves. She devised a plan in which all three would have alibis. The mother decided her 15-year-old son, Danny, would commit the murder. Christina's role was to call and lure John to the office. Christina gave Danny the keys to her car, even though he didn't even have a driver's license yet. The accomplices took a huge risk, and at any moment, things could have gone awry. Nevertheless, the teenager climbed out of his bedroom window to avoid being noticed by his younger sisters, got in the car, drove to the office, and waited. He saw the parents arrive, hid behind a dumpster, and waited for an opportunity to shoot. When John approached the car and opened the door, Danny ran up and fired. The gun accidentally fired a second time when he tried to reach for the man's wallet, hence the second shell casing being far from the body. This clarified one of the mysteries that had been troubling the investigators. Danny then fled, got into the car, and quickly returned home, where Christina awaited with a bag into which he placed his clothes, the weapon, and the wallet. He took a shower, and they didn't discuss it further. Christina later handed the bag to her mother, and Judy disposed of it. Following Christina and Danny's confessions, both were arrested. Now the police had to arrest the puppeteer behind her husband's murder, Judy Parker. But the police had absolutely nothing against her. Fortunately, her children agreed to testify against their mother in exchange for reduced sentences. Then Judy decided to confess her guilt in 2009. Christina was sentenced to 5 years in prison for her role in the crime. However, after her release in 2013, she died of a drug overdose at the age of 27. Danny was sentenced to 23 years. He was released 3 years after his sister in 2016. Judy was sentenced to 33 years in prison. She was released in 2023. Judy spent her entire life as a sales agent, and she certainly found a way to sell the idea of murder to her own children. Most likely, she manipulated them for years, and only when they were distanced from her could they clearly see the whole picture. Of course, Judy could have divorced, but she would have received only half of the property and wouldn't have received the $1 million from the insurance. Additionally, John had evidence of marital infidelity. He gave his wife a ticket to a luxurious life, but she no longer wanted to see her husband nearby, yet she wanted to have it all, and anyone standing in her way between the life she had and the life she wanted had to disappear. She forced her teenage children to commit murder, robbing them of their childhood and burdening them with a heavy load. And she shattered the lives of her younger daughters, who now have no father, no older sister, and essentially no mother. Megan Carr and Cherish DeSantis seemed destined to become best friends. The girls were born just a day apart, attended the same school, clubs, and activities together, and their parents thought each of them had 2 daughters. Both of their families were quite wealthy. Megan's father owned and managed a company specializing in drilling water wells. It had been a family business since the 1940s, bringing in around $2 million annually. However, by 1992, Megan's parents had divorced, and she lived with her mom, Shirley. As for Cherish's father, he was a well-known tobacco auctioneer in town and nationwide for over 30 years. While such auctions are not as common now back then, it was a thriving business. In the spring of 1992, 16-year-old Megan and Cherish were popular students at Thomasville High School in Georgia. Their families made sure their daughters behaved appropriately, although there was never a need for concern. The girls never caused trouble, excelled in their studies, and all their activities were within the bounds of propriety. Even during vacations, they looked forward to peaceful beach getaways rather than raucous parties. Thursday, March 26, 1992, marked the last day before spring break. After that, students could forget about school until April 6th. Megan and Cherish were eager to squeeze in some beach time. Not in Thomasville, of course, but in Florida, less than 60 kilometers away. For Thomasville students, crossing the border to visit the beaches of Tallahassee was a common practice. It took about 2 hours, and the trip was quite enjoyable. The young women preferred a single beach that wasn't overrun by tourists. It was called Bold Point, a picturesque 13-kilometer shoreline, popular for birdwatching, wildlife, and yes, alligators, hence its name. Overall, it was a wonderful spot to relax under the sun and take a swim. That was Megan and Cherish's plan. Therefore, at 10 o'clock on Friday morning, the girls packed their swimsuits, towels, and, hopping into Megan's new Honda, headed for Florida, planning to spend the entire day at the beach. They intended to return home that same evening. Some of their friends were supposed to join them, but at the last moment, some had second thoughts or urgent matters came up. The girls arrived at Alligator Point Beach around noon. Megan parked the car, they grabbed their towels, changed into their bikinis, and turned on the rock station on the boombox. After wandering leisurely along the beach for a few hours, a married couple noticed the girls and, seeing that they were resting in a somewhat unusual pose, one girl lying on top of the other, decided not to disturb them. The couple veered wide around them to avoid causing any disturbance. However, on their way back, they realized that the girls hadn't moved at all. Even as they openly stared at them for minutes, the girls remained still. The man asked his wife to stay put while he approached them closer. He saw blood and shouted to his wife that the girls appeared to be dead and they needed to call the police. Alligator Point Beach was a family-friendly beach where visitors enjoyed walks and picnics. The police were aware that there had never been attacks on women at this beach. Therefore, the arriving officers were also horrified by what had happened. The ongoing contrast of the radio continuing to play rock music added to the chilling atmosphere of the murder scene juxtaposed against the carefree beach setting. The officers found the girls' identification and conducted a preliminary identification. They were 16-year-old Megan and Cherish. In addition to their documents, all their belongings were nearby: wallets, cash, Megan's car keys, beach bags, and towels. The girls were in bikinis, so the police ruled out robbery or violence against them as motives. Megan had a towel draped over her head soaked in her blood. Cherish lay on Megan with a head wound as well. As later determined by the medical examiner, each girl had been shot twice in the head from close range with a .38 caliber firearm. There was a lot of blood around the bodies. Besides the bullet holes, there were no other injuries on the victims, as if they had been caught off guard and didn't fight for their lives. Therefore, reluctantly, the police had to consider whether this was someone the girls knew. It seemed unlikely that a stranger could have approached so closely without the victims screaming or attempting to escape. And who could have known they would be relaxing in this isolated part of the beach? It appeared that the attack was planned, and someone had been monitoring them and traveled all the way from home. But who would want to kill two schoolgirls? The police began interviewing possible witnesses among local residents and regular beachgoers because although it was a remote part of the beach, families were nearby and cars were parked in the lot. They should have heard gunshots or the victims' cries. One regular beachgoer indeed heard sounds around 12:30 that he mistook for fireworks. Now, of course, it was evident he had heard 4 gunshots. Shortly afterward, a car passed by him that he hadn't seen there before. It was a long blue car resembling a Chevrolet Nova or something similar. Officers also went to the parking lot where Megan's car was parked and noticed something strange. There were plenty of open parking spots, but someone had blocked Megan's car in such a way that she couldn't leave. It wasn't a Chevrolet, but the car turned out to be blue. Approaching, the officers saw a man inside with a camera on his lap. When asked what he was doing there, the man explained that he had been photographing birds in the area all day. He had seen people, of course, but not teenage girls dancing on the beach. He rather aggressively stated that he had no interest in watching girls dance on the beach. Curiously, who mentioned anything about dancing on the beach? The man was taken in for questioning and a weapon was found in his trunk. The police were already rubbing their hands, thinking they had quickly solved the case. During questioning, the man admitted he had seen the girls but denied any involvement in the murders, claiming they were alive when he passed by them on the beach. He even underwent a polygraph test. The gun found in his trunk turned out to be a completely different caliber than the murder weapon, so the suspect was released. The bartender from the establishment near the beach where the girls died recalled a strange incident that occurred on the day of the murders involving an unusual visitor. He entered as soon as the establishment opened, ordered a Bloody Mary cocktail, but the bartender wasn't quite ready for service due to a delay, so she told the man the drink would be on the house. However, he insisted on paying. This alone wouldn't have been odd, except for his words. "You'd better take this money because it's the first and last time I'll come in here." Whether he meant to offend her or not, he stayed in the bar for 40 minutes and left shortly before the presumed time of Megan and Cherish's murders. Meanwhile, it was getting dark, approaching dinner time, when Megan and Cherish were expected home, but they hadn't returned. Megan's mother called Cherish's parents to see if her daughter was with them, but they hadn't seen her either. The woman was a bit worried, but she knew the girls were responsible and assumed they were just running a bit late. Unfortunately, that was not the case. The Florida police notified their colleagues in Thomasville about what had happened and asked them to inform the families of the victims. How can anyone prepare someone for the news that their loved one will never come home again? It was a tragedy for both families. They felt as though they had lost two daughters. Although the officers tried to be as tactful as possible, they needed to ask several questions. The girls' relatives explained that they spent almost all their time together, either at Megan's house or Cherish's. The only other person they spent a lot of time with was Alex, Cherish's boyfriend. The families insisted that Alex had nothing to do with the murders, but everyone was considered a suspect until ruled out by the police. Moreover, they were troubled by how the killer got so close to the girls. This meant they didn't see him as a threat. Therefore, suspicion fell on Alex next. But he seemed genuinely grieving, just like everyone else, unable to believe they were gone. The police were convinced that Alex must have known where the girls would be hanging out. He replied that he could have found out if he wanted to, but they never discussed it. Additionally, when Megan and Cherish went to the beach, he was at work in the factory. His colleagues indeed confirmed the young man's alibi, so the police left Alex alone and allowed him to mourn the loss of his girlfriend and her friend. The police had no solid leads and disclosed almost nothing to the public. Therefore, all sorts of wild rumors circulated about the motive for the murders. Some speculated that the girls were random victims of drug smuggling, with smugglers landing on the beach and killing unwanted witnesses. However, there was no evidence of any boat landing on the beach. Others recalled that the beach used to be a nudist beach and suggested the girls might have been targeted for occasionally sunbathing topless there. But Megan and Cherish were in bikinis, so this theory didn't make sense. The most plausible theory was that someone was upset about Cherish's father's tobacco business, perhaps due to a failed deal, and took out their anger on his daughter. However, the police couldn't find any evidence to support this theory. Time passed, and the police couldn't make progress. There was neither a motive nor evidence to find the culprit. Even experienced police officers didn't know what to do. Meanwhile, societal pressure was mounting. The only lead that demanded substantial police resources was the blue Chevrolet Nova. Police spoke with all owners of similar blue cars in the state of Florida. In Georgia, they couldn't do this because in 1992, the state lacked a database of car colors. Officers went door to door, interviewing car owners. Several times they felt they were onto something, such as when they discovered that an owner of a similar model lived across the street from one of the girls, or when they found a former convict acting suspiciously at the crime scene. But all these promising leads didn't amount to anything. Suddenly, a woman called the sheriff's office in Tallahassee. She claimed to know who shot the girls because she was on the beach when it happened. This call was a godsend for the police, giving them renewed hope that the case would be solved. She said the man's name was Sam Haynes, and he lived near the beach. However, when asked to identify herself, she hung up. She had called from a payphone, so tracing her location was impossible. Although the police desperately wanted to find her, as she confessed to being involved in the crime, they couldn't locate her. It turned out that despite Sam living near the beach, he was actually working at a construction site in Atlanta, Georgia, 6 hours away from the crime scene. Investigators suspected Sam might have followed the girls when they drove that day. Upon learning he was being sought, Sam contacted the police himself. He claimed he was at work in Atlanta on March 27th and insisted someone was lying about him. Sam suspected it was Linda, his ex-wife's sister. As it turned out, Sam was not mistaken. Linda accused her former brother-in-law of the high-profile murder of the two girls, as revenge for mistreatment of her sister. It's remarkable she took this step, considering she could have been arrested herself. In any case, detectives spent a lot of time in vain. If it weren't for the next crucial event, they wouldn't have solved the case, no matter how hard they worked. On Friday, May 15th at 10 a.m., the sheriff's office received another call. It was a resident of Tallahassee claiming to know who killed Megan and Cherish. The killer was her ex-boyfriend, Robert Neil Rodriguez. This sounded familiar to the investigators, who had lost hope of it being anything other than another scorned ex. So they asked her why she thought he had killed someone. But the woman said he confessed himself. Robert had called her the previous evening and told her everything, convincing her he was serious. He begged her to wait until the next morning to call the police. She kept her promise. One detective thought the man's name sounded vaguely familiar and reviewed the list of people involved in the case. Robert's name was indeed on it because he owned a blue car, though not a Chevrolet Nova, but a 1979 Plymouth Volare, a model very similar to the Chevrolet. The caller couldn't provide any more information, particularly about Robert's current location, but she knew he planned to leave town and was armed. She added that he had previously lived with his mother in Tallahassee, about an hour's drive from Alligator Point Beach. Robert's neighbors confirmed he had moved out of the apartment on May 2nd or 3rd. During the search of his apartment, books on death and other items suggesting a specific, possibly depressed state of mind were found, but no weapon. The police stations around the country were informed of the new suspect's description. Meanwhile, the investigators tried to recall what Robert had told them that caused them to strike his name from the suspect list. But as they began to delve into his past, they were horrified to realize that he was a former police officer from Portland, Oregon. He served in the police force for 2 years, from 1975 to 1977. The officers were shocked because the murderer who committed such a terrible crime could have been one of them. When they approached him about his blue car, he immediately claimed to be a former police officer himself and offered to undergo a polygraph test. But the police stated that it was just a routine check and left him alone. As it turned out, they were wrong. Incredibly, just 8 hours after the woman's call at 6 p.m., the police phone rang again. This time, it was a man introducing himself as Robert Neil Rodriguez. Being a former police officer, he immediately provided his driver's license number to prove it was really him. Then Robert convinced the officer that he was the one who committed the murder. He simply confessed. Robert provided the police with information known only to the killer. For example, the fact that Megan had a towel on her face. He even said he was calling from a payphone on the road in New Mexico, heading to the Grand Canyon National Park, driving his Plymouth. Robert's voice sounded so detached and subdued that detectives feared he might do something foolish. Detectives asked him to surrender to help him, but Robert said it was too late for him and he wouldn't go to prison. He feared that as a former police officer, he would have a hard time in prison. Detectives hurried to find the man, but were also afraid to show his photo in the news. They feared that if Robert's photo appeared in the news, he might do something irreversible, or someone else might take matters into their own hands. The next morning, on May 16th in New Mexico along the route to the Grand Canyon National Park, a blue Plymouth was found on the highway. The license plates on the car were from Utah, but when they checked them, it turned out they had been stolen on May 8th from a parking lot in Utah. The car was just parked on the highway. Inside sat a man who matched the description of Robert Rodriguez. He looked as though he had lost consciousness. A vial with a white substance dangled from a leather lace around his neck, and a handwritten note lay on the dashboard. The note was addressed to anyone who found the man. In it, Robert, confirming it was indeed him, wrote that he had taken cyanide and under no circumstances should anyone try to revive him with artificial respiration, as the rescuer might get poisoned themselves. On the passenger seat was a notebook, where Robert explained in more detail that he had consumed cyanide mixed with scotch for the parents of Megan and Cherish and to avoid imprisonment. There was a gun in the car, but it was a .22 caliber, not the one used to fire the deadly bullets. However, the most intriguing part was that according to Robert's final promise, the Florida police should expect a letter from him detailing how and why he killed the girls. When the parents of the girls heard the news, they were shocked and puzzled. Megan's father wondered, could they have hired a former police officer as a hitman? He couldn't fathom the idea that a stranger could shoot his daughter just like that. He believed it must have been a professional killer. Meanwhile, Cherish's mother, upon learning about the discoveries during the search of Robert Rodriguez's home, wondered if he was a serial killer who hated women. If he was so obsessed with killings, shouldn't he have killed more than 2 people by his age? Of course, at that time, she didn't know how close to the truth she was. And then, on May 18th, the first letter from Robert surfaced. It didn't go to the police, but to a newspaper. In it, he disclosed where the police should look for his body because initially Robert had intended to reach the canyon. He also claimed that he would be sought in connection with 3 committed murders. Incredibly, he admitted that the police themselves wouldn't have been able to link him to 3 murders, but he simply couldn't stay silent. In 1984, he killed another innocent girl, Valerie Hunt. That his 3rd victim was Valerie Hunt. He killed her in 1984, and the police will receive all the details about the murders by mail. Valerie was a 22-year-old student from Tallahassee. Her body was found in September of that same year near the pond. The police initially treated the case as a disappearance, possibly suspecting she had run away, but everyone who knew her didn't believe she would willingly disappear. Her boyfriend reported her disappearance when her boss called to say she hadn't shown up for work, although she was always reliable. Like Megan and Cherish, Valerie went to the pond to swim and sunbathe. She frequented the area often, was a strong swimmer, and it was incredible that she drowned. The cause of her death was undetermined because her body was heavily decomposed. Now, finally, it became clear that she was Robert Rodriguez's first victim. On the 19th, finally, a letter arrived at the police, after which Robert's messages were received by the families of all his victims, his friends, and former girlfriends with whom he had good relationships. The police didn't disclose the details of the message until they had verified every word from the man. They asked the families of the girls to do the same, but Megan's father decided differently. He saw both letters, Megan and Cherish's families, and said they were practically identical, with no hint of an apology in either. Robert revealed the details of how he committed the crime, although Megan's father would have preferred him not to. On March 27th, around noon, Robert entered a cafe near Alligator Point Beach. It was he who ordered a Bloody Mary cocktail and insisted on paying for it. The bartender confirmed this when she saw his picture. He left the establishment around 1 p.m. and headed to the beach. Witnesses who found the bodies passed Megan and Cherish at 1:45, and they were already dead. That is, after leaving the bar, he immediately went to the beach where he saw the girls and killed them. He was haunted by a fantasy in which he raped, beat, and killed a girl. These thoughts had plagued him for a long time, and he couldn't find an explanation or justification for this obsession. And though he dreamed of violence, he assured the police and the girls' families that he hadn't done anything like that to Valerie, Megan, or Cherish. After killing Valerie, he told himself he could live a normal life and that if he did it again, he would kill himself. And then, when he came across Megan and Cherish, he couldn't hold back. They did nothing to provoke him. He had never met them before, but chose them because they were young, attractive, and vacationing in a remote area. It was all over in seconds. He shot Megan first. Cherish began to scream and back away. Then he shot her. Megan had a towel in her hand and it fell over her head when he shot. Then he shot each one more time to make sure they were dead before fleeing. All the letters were written matter-of-factly, and there was practically no emotion in them. It must have been very difficult to read them. Megan's mom again raised the question that worried everyone. How could he harbor this passion for murder for 8 long years before killing again? Megan's father speculated that Robert became engrossed in religion, then lost faith again, and therefore killed again. But investigators noticed another interesting pattern. He divorced shortly before Valerie's murder in 1984, and he had just broken up with his girlfriend before Megan and Cherish's murders. One of his church friends said he sometimes got angry about relationships. Maybe that's how he vented his anger. And his mother died on Easter morning in 1992, and since he no longer had any truly close people, he decided to confess everything. The pastor of his church said Robert was struggling internally. His loving and caring nature fought against the evil inside him. He stuttered about suicide at least twice, and he was taking medication previously used to treat depression, but its effect was linked to aggressive behavior and thoughts of harming himself. When people gathered for service on Sunday, May 17th, and didn't see Robert, they couldn't believe what they had learned about him. They called him Bob, sincerely loved him, helped others, and he wasn't the person they read about in the news. One woman said it was so much like him, warning that he had taken cyanide. Another admitted she wouldn't be able to read news about criminals and judge them as before because she knew one personally. She will think about the people who loved this man, because they exist, and she is one of them. It's clear that Robert didn't understand the reason behind his obsession and didn't want to harm innocent strangers. It's unfortunate that he couldn't overcome his inner demons and stop himself before taking the lives of 3 innocent individuals, Valerie Hunt, Megan Carr, and Cherish DeSantis, and breaking the hearts of both their loved ones and his own. The only monsters that ever scared little Bria were imaginary. But on November 20th, 2000, just a day before 3 armed men in masks stormed into her home, she called her mom, Michelle, and said she saw someone outside the window. Michelle glanced outside, saw no one, and simply brushed off her daughter's words, attributing it to childish imagination. However, this incident was unlike any previous ones because she saw them when they peered through the window. They had been there the night before, and now these people held Michelle and Bria at gunpoint in the living room of their own home. November 2000. A quiet suburb of San Diego, California. 35-year-old Michelle Renee arrived home from the bank where she worked as a manager. She lived in a rather secluded house with her 7-year-old daughter, Bria. She worked as a bank manager, dedicating much time and effort to climb the ranks over 13 years of hard work to achieve a position where she was trusted and respected. It had been a long day, and she was glad to be home with Bria. They were sitting on the couch, just 2 of them, playing Game Boy, when a deafeningly loud sound erupted from somewhere behind them. Michelle turned around and saw 3 people. They burst into the house as if they were some kind of takeover team. However, this clearly wasn't a SWAT team. The strangers were armed and dressed entirely in black. Michelle and Bria screamed. Michelle managed to notice her daughter darting into another room when she herself was seized by her hair, a gun directed at her face, and thrown to the floor near the couch. They tied the woman with duct tape and then turned her so that she could see her daughter lying face down near the door. Her hands and legs were bound. Bria asked, "Are you going to kill Mommy? Are you going to kill me?" Michelle also believed they had broken in to kill them. But the strangers replied, "No, if the mother does everything we tell her to." They flatly told Michelle, "You will rob the bank for us, or we will kill you, and your daughter will be the first." Illegal intruders informed Michelle that they had been monitoring her for months, knowing she was a bank manager and had devised a plan. They would spend the whole night with her to instruct and ensure she precisely knew what to do. Throughout the night, the gang leader gave her clear instructions, repeatedly emphasizing what she must do, while they held her and her daughter restrained on the couch with tape. He explained to Michelle that outside, 6 more gang members were guarding, ready to kill her if she made any foolish moves. As if to confirm his words, around 11 o'clock, his attention was drawn to a voice coming from the radio, a female voice. The accomplice informed him that a car had stopped on the driveway. Michelle and Bria's neighbor had arrived. Her name was Kimbra, and she lived in the same building. She returned from a night out and was clearly heavily intoxicated. When the criminals attempted to grab her, she resisted, startling them. One of the criminals aimed the weapon directly at Kimbra's face and yelled not to force him to act. Michelle pushed his arm away to protect her friend, but he aimed the gun at her and hissed for her never to touch him again. Finally, they tied up Kimbra, and together they waited for morning. Michelle realized it might be her last night with her daughter. She had to tell Bria everything she wanted. The woman smoothed her daughter's hair to let her rest a bit, thinking it might be the last time she ever touched her hair or saw her sleeping. In the morning, the nightmare continued. At 6 o'clock, the leader of the robbers ordered her to get up and get ready for work. She dressed and started to arrange her hair when he interrupted her to put dynamite on her. He fastened it tightly on her back with tape, causing her intense pain. The criminals similarly equipped Kimbra and Bria with sets of explosives. The girl cried and asked what it was, but the mother didn't want her to be even more scared and just mumbled something. Then they showed Michelle an object resembling a door lock. The man stated that it was a detonator, and if she made even one wrong move, he would press the button. He added that the detonator had a 10-mile radius. The criminals put Bria in the closet in her bedroom. The mother repeated that she would return soon, that everything would be fine. "Be brave, Mommy," her daughter replied as she left the house. 2 men stayed inside while the leader of the gang handed Michelle a suitcase with a sports bag inside before hiding in the back seat of her Jeep. In a minute, she was on her way to work, as she did every day. But this time, she had dynamite attached to her back and a gun pressed against her side. Upon arriving, she parked in her usual spot. and before getting out of the car, the man stated that she had 5 minutes to come out with the money after the arrival of the cash collector. If something went wrong, his finger was on the detonator. The cash collector arrived around 9 o'clock and delivered the money. As a bank manager, Michelle was responsible for receiving the money. As soon as his car left, Michelle asked her colleague to accompany her to the vault, where she explained what was happening. Her colleague watched in horror as the bank manager did something so unimaginable. But Michelle couldn't do anything but stuff the bag with bundles of money. Her heart raced. Was she doing everything fast enough? Michelle's colleagues, of course, reported the incident to the police. But before that, she left the bank with $360,000. She got into the Jeep and prepared to follow further instructions. After a few blocks, the criminal ordered Michelle to get out of the car, saying she would find her Jeep further down the street. And so it happened. She found her car, jumped in, and sped home. The woman arrived home not knowing if she would find her daughter there, alive. As she pulled up to the house, she immediately noticed Kendra's car was missing. Entering the house, she called out for Bria, but it was eerily silent. Finally, she heard a faint voice. Bria was calling her from the far end of the house. The girl was still in the closet where her mother had left her. The woman embraced her daughter with relief, but it wasn't over yet. Bria noticed panic on her mother's face. The leader of the gang had left, but hadn't removed the dynamite from her. What if the criminals used the detonator from a distance? Kimbra told Michelle that before leaving, they simply removed the dynamite from her back, and the girl by cutting the tape and discarded the explosives against the far wall. Then together, they all ran to the neighboring houses. Soon the street was flooded with investigators from the police, FBI, and even a bomb disposal team. The officers quickly determined that the dynamite was fake, just 2 red-painted sticks. But considering the dim lighting and the fact that they were on the victims' backs in such an emergency situation, no one would risk their lives assuming they were not real. However, during a truly terrifying 14 hours being held hostage, Michelle tried to memorize any detail that could help identify the criminals. It allowed her to focus not on the horror of the situation, but on something else. In fact, it was her unique ability to notice details in people's appearance and behavior that others might overlook. She memorized the build of the criminals, tried to estimate their height based on the furniture in the house, noted what jeans and shoes they wore, what the weapons looked like. At some point, she needed to visit the bathroom, and the gang leader went with her. When he escorted her to the bathroom, she flicked the switch, brightly illuminating the man's face. Of course, he still wore a mask, but Michelle clearly saw his eyes, quite large, expressive, slightly reddish at the corners. She suddenly realized she had seen this person before, in her bank office. As a bank manager, she often dealt with new client accounts, and just that day, a man came to her office. He explained that he would soon inherit a large sum and needed information about opening accounts and investments. He sat at her desk, asking the same questions over and over again, when finally, a woman entered and said, "Chris, we need to go." The man introduced his companion as Lisa, and they left. But before leaving, he handed Michelle his business card. She placed it in the top drawer of her desk. All these thoughts raced through Michelle's mind, and she thought she needed to be very cautious and by no means show that she recognized him. And she also recognized his accomplice because it was Lisa's voice periodically coming from the radio. If she made a mistake, they wouldn't leave her alive. Now Michelle asked the officers to check the top drawer of her desk as soon as possible. The business card was indeed there, and it wasn't a fake. The man's name was Christopher Butler. The FBI soon learned that Butler was a convicted bank robber. They found out where he lived and put him under surveillance. Butler and his fiancée, Lisa Ramirez, lived just a few kilometers from the bank. Detectives quickly identified the identities of the other 2 men. Christopher Higgins, a large man, guarded Michelle, and Robert Ortiz, the guy who had his eye on Bria. On December 1st, it was decided to arrest Christopher and Lisa. They were stopped supposedly during a routine traffic stop for document verification. The evidence in the car was simply incredibly vast. There was a pneumatic gun in the glove compartment, but in a stressful situation, it looked entirely real. Furthermore, the officers found a black bag described by Michelle, homemade masks, gloves, Michelle's credit cards, adhesive ribbons for banknotes, and even a door lock that the criminals successfully passed off as a detonator. In the house, 2 investigators awaited even more evidence. Officers found all the components to create a fake dynamite and a sample of dynamite with Christopher and Lisa's fingerprints. The accomplices left so much evidence because they were confident the crime wouldn't be traced back to them. However, what the officers didn't find either in the car or the house were the stolen $360,000. Arresting Higgins on the same day, they seized $93,000. Higgins confessed to everything and mentioned spending a few thousand on a trip to Vegas. Ortiz went on the run. When he was arrested 3 months later in Wisconsin, he had $32,000 from the bank. He also confessed to everything. However, Christopher Butler denied everything, even when presented with undeniable evidence, his fingerprints on the dynamite. He tried to put the blame on Lisa, but Lisa decided differently. She confessed to being the female voice Michelle heard on the radio. She even admitted it was her idea to use fake dynamite and steal the bank manager. Lisa revealed they split the money into 3 parts, but more than $100,000, their share with Butler, were stolen. To everyone's surprise, she claimed Michelle was involved in the conspiracy. The police had to verify everything. They reconstructed the events of that day, and Michelle behaved precisely as a genuine victim of the crime would. All the stories from the victims, Higgins and Ortiz, matched in every minute detail, and investigators couldn't find any evidence that Michelle was involved in the conspiracy. By the spring of 2001, all 4 suspects were behind bars, awaiting trial. However, Michelle and Bria were still coming to terms with that night of terror. The girl desperately wanted to hide somewhere because she believed that the criminals would eventually find and kill them. She transformed from a happy, bold, and lively child into a frightened creature, afraid of being left alone. That's why in June, Michelle took Bria to Alaska to stay with her grandmother. Leaving the child with her grandmother, she returned to finalize everything and moved to Alaska. With her dog, practically no money, and a camera, she embarked on a 9-day journey by car. She had only 9 days on the road because she promised to be back for Bria's birthday. It was only after they moved that their healing truly began. When they returned to San Diego a year later for the trial, Michelle and Bria were ready to face their offenders. The investigators gathered so much evidence that Michelle was convinced the trial was nothing more than a formality. How wrong she was. Christopher and Lisa were tried together, since Lisa confessed during a videotaped interrogation, claiming innocence would be difficult. Thus, her lawyer proposed a deal to prosecutor Tom Manning to save her from life imprisonment, but he rejected the offer. However, since Lisa incriminated not only herself, but also Christopher during the interrogation, the judge was forced to prohibit using her statements in court. Without Lisa's confession, the case relied almost entirely on Michelle's words. Christopher and Lisa's lawyers decided to go after Michelle, trying to shake her credibility. Furious witnesses don't seem reliable to the jury. They succeeded, and Michelle did not perform well on the witness stand. The thing was, Michelle wasn't quite the ordinary victim. For many years, she had worked as a stripper. The woman didn't hide it. It was a choice she had to make to survive at a young age. Michelle fled home at 15 and worked hard to advance from the position of a bank manager to a regional vice president before accepting a bank manager job to spend more time with Bria. Even while working at the bank, she continued exotic dancing for some time. But there was something more that cast doubt on Michelle's honesty as a witness. To get a job at the bank, she faked her resume and other documents, listing skills and experience she didn't have. From a legal perspective, this seemed less than ideal. Additionally, Butler's lawyer delved into her intimate life, trying to portray her as a reckless, selfish mother willing to do anything for money. She had financial difficulties, which could have been a motive for conspiracy. Lisa's lawyer claimed that Michelle lied about recognizing Lisa's voice on the radio since there was no mention of it in the FBI reports. As Lisa's admission was not heard in court, there was nothing to prevent him from boldly stating that the voice heard on the radio was not his client's. Then he questioned Michelle about marked bills, those banknotes that banks keep in safes in case of a robbery and can be traced. The criminals warned her against taking such notes, and she had no intention of putting her daughter's life in danger. But now the lawyer claimed that it was suspicious. He also questioned her maternal instincts. Would a mother run to a house where her daughter is, knowing dynamite is tied to her back? After Michelle's 3-day testimony, it was Christopher's turn. Under oath, he claimed that everything was orchestrated by Michelle, and he had a romantic involvement with her. Of course, he had no evidence, but his strategy was clear. Firstly, he was determined to protect Lisa at all costs. Secondly, The robbery was not considered as severe as kidnapping for robbery, but his strategy worked only partially. The jurors deliberated for 5 days and found Christopher guilty of robbery and kidnapping Bria and Kimbra, but they were not certain about Michelle's kidnapping. One juror believed Butler, and 2 abstained. He was sentenced to 3 consecutive life imprisonments, plus an additional 64 years. Lisa was found not guilty on all counts. The second trial went entirely differently, and both Huggins and Ortiz were quickly found guilty. They were each sentenced to 32 years. As for the remaining $260,000 bank funds, they were never found. So the guilty were serving their sentences in prison. But for Bria and Michelle, it was just the beginning. Their path to healing was not easy, but at some point Michelle realized that she could be angry and blame all her life's failures on the kidnappers, or she could take control and become an example and support for her daughter. So she did. From scratch, she started her own PR company, spoke extensively in public, shared her story with other victims of assault, and wrote a book, which was adapted into a film, In Captivity. Inspired by her mother's example, Bria pursued her dreams. She joined the cheerleading team at school, and despite being diagnosed with multiple sclerosis at 18, obtained a college education. However, after 20 years since their world was shattered, they had to face the past again. In June 2020, Christopher became eligible for parole. Prosecutor Tom Manning decided he should be present at the hearing. He had a plan. He questioned Christopher Butler about all the lies he told in court. It was a risky plan. Christopher could have insisted on his version and taken the truth to his grave, but he confessed that he and Michelle had no relationship, and she was never involved in the conspiracy. However, he didn't take responsibility for the crime, accusing his ex-girlfriend Lisa Ramirez. He expressed deep regret for what his victims had gone through because of him. Christopher admitted that he regretted his actions and was deeply moved by Michelle's book. Although Michelle and Bria forgave him, they did not support his release, and he was denied several times. Their attitude towards the other 2 men was fundamentally different, especially towards Ortiz. He was the one who apologized to Michelle in court. Bria spoke at his parole hearing in his favor, and Ortiz was released in January 2021. Now, Michelle and Bria are closer than ever, working together in Michelle's founded company. Michelle wrote another book about her 9-day healing journey to Alaska, which changed her perspective on the world. In July 2019, an unprecedented scandal erupted in Romania, demonstrating how the police respond to calls to the emergency service. The call to number 112 was received on July 25th at 11:05. The caller, a 15-year-old schoolgirl named Alexandra Masisanu, struggling to speak, told the operator that she had been kidnapped, beaten, assaulted, and was being held against her will in some house.
Alo?
Bună ziua!
Bună ziua!
Vreau și o legătură cu poliția.
Da. Ce s-a întâmplat?
Doamnă,
Nu vă numiți.
sunt domnișoara, am 15 ani și ieri am fost sequestrată de către un domn.
Cum te cheamă?
She didn't know where she was, but only knew that she was in the city of CARACAL. Before the call was interrupted, the operator sarcastically asked how they would find her if she didn't tell them her location.
Mă cheam Alexandra, vă rog, veniți repede, nu știu unde sunt.
Cum adică nu știi unde ești? În ce localitate te afli?
În Caracal, m-a dus în Caracal, dar nu știu unde exact.
Păi dă-mi un punct de reper unde te afli în Caracal. Cum crezi că te găsim?
Fortunately, Alexandra called again at 11:06, and the operator once again tried to ascertain her location. The girl managed to provide important details. For example, she had seen a dam before the kidnapper blindfolded her eyes. He had a gray car, and she was being held in a very old, dilapidated house near a gas station. There was a lot of grass and bushes in the yard, as well as 2 dogs. She even mentioned a name and an address that she read from a business card she found, and explained that she was calling from the kidnapper's phone. The operator relayed the situation to a police officer who continued to communicate with the girl. He told her to stay where she was because they were sending a team. Alexandra tried to provide more description of the kidnapper's car in the yard, but the police officer wasn't listening anymore. The schoolgirl called again at 11:12 and asked if they had sent anyone to help her. Another police officer replied irritably that the team had already been dispatched but couldn't reach her in 2 minutes. Alexandra begged the police officer to stay on the line with her because she was terrified, but he responded that they had other calls to attend to. "The team will arrive in 2 or 3 minutes, what the hell?" he added. The girl reluctantly agreed. Although the emergency services personnel knew that the kidnapper was supposed to return any minute, they inexplicably called Alexandra 9 more times, but no one answered. Not surprisingly, even if the girl had initially tried to discreetly place the phone back, the kidnapper now knew for certain that she had called the police. 12 hours after Alexandra's call, the police finally brought her father to the station, allowed him to listen to the emergency call, and asked if he recognized his daughter's voice. When the man confirmed that it was her voice, they believed it was not a prank, and only then did they begin their investigation. Unfortunately, the name on the business card Alexandra found belonged to a man who had no connection to the case, and the specialized telecommunications service couldn't trace the origin of the call. Technicians were able to provide the officers with a very wide search radius and 3 possible locations for the girl, but none of the specified locations were correct. At that point, the police turned to surveillance camera recordings to identify a vehicle involved in a similar case. Once they identified the driver, they surrounded his house. Despite not being legally required, the police applied for a warrant and simply waited. They received the warrant at 6 in the morning on July 26th, a staggering 19 hours after Alexandra's call. Only then did they knock on the suspect's house gate. Of course, they were late. Inside the house, they found Alexandra's clothes and jewelry in the car, the girl's earring, and in the yard, a metallic barrel with ashes and human remains. The man stated that he doesn't know any Alexandru Mashishano, and the ashes in the barrel remained after the fire he lit to defend himself from persistent mosquitoes. However, after a thorough examination of the barrel's contents, investigators found 6 teeth. The results of the laboratory analysis left no room for doubt. The teeth belonged to Alexandra. The police arrested the homeowner, 66-year-old Georga Dinka, a retired mechanic. Neighbors knew Georga as an aggressive and inhumane person. So inhumane that he had a special code for his rare visitors. 3 knocks on the door. He suffered from antisocial personality disorder, had been admitted to a mental institution 5 times, and his troubled childhood could have been a possible reason for his condition. Georga's father worked as a butcher, engaging in illegal meat trade, often killing and butchering animals in front of his son, forcing the boy to assist. This soon became routine, and Georga himself was already killing stray animals for his twisted pleasure. His father was a heavy drinker and frequently beat the boy, using belts, brooms, and even the hose from the washing machine multiple times a day. He also tied his son up with a wire to prevent him from going outside to play with other kids. Interestingly, later on, Georga started treating his own victims the same way. Not surprisingly, the boy performed poorly in school. However, when he joined the army, it seemed like his life was getting on track, and he found his place, until he assaulted another soldier who turned out to be the son of a defense ministry official. Expelled from the army, Georga returned home and got a job as a general laborer at a hospital. He worked there for 8 years before attempting to find work on construction sites in Italy. Once again, things didn't work out, as he was fired after brutally beating an Albanian worker. After attacking a young woman, he was deported from the country. Upon returning to Romania, he worked as a mechanic, drove taxis, and also collected and sold scrap metal. Despite his inhumane behavior and reclusiveness, he managed to start a family and became the father of 4 children. His wife, tired of his constant abuse, lived and worked in Italy. Sources close to Georga say that when his wife came to Romania for the last time, he severely beat her. All 4 children left their father's house. 3 sons chose to live with their mother, while the daughter settled in Timisoara. After George's arrest, she insisted that she had no contact with her father, whom she considered mentally unstable. So, as it appears, Georga Dinka was a recluse, living in isolation, and his behavioral issues couldn't resolve on their own. Another shocking piece of news shocked the public. Georga confessed to the murder of the second girl, whom he abducted in April, 2 months prior to Alexandra's kidnapping. The second victim of the man was an 18-year-old named Luisa Melencu. Until the age of 12, Luisa lived in Italy with her mother, Monica Melencu, who worked there and engaged in vegetable cultivation. However, in search of a better life and income, Monica moved to the United Kingdom, while Louisa chose to finish school in her homeland and lived with her grandparents. She dedicated a lot of time to her studies and was determined to get an excellent education to find a job with a decent salary to support her family. But she relied on her mother's support for the time being. On April 14th, her mother sent her money for sports shoes. Louisa went to an ATM in CARACAL, but for some reason, she couldn't withdraw money. She called her grandfather to let him know she was on her way home and headed to the bus stop. However, since it was Sunday and public transportation was scarce, especially in rural areas where locals often complained about its unreliability even on weekdays, Louisa decided to hitchhike. Unfortunately, Gheorghe Dinka was passing by. He agreed to give her a ride. Louisa struck up a conversation and told him about her failed attempt to get money from the ATM. Upon hearing this, Gheorghe offered her 30 lei, approximately $7, for intimate services. She refused, after which Gheorghe decided to take what he wanted by force. Meanwhile, Louisa's grandfather began to worry because he knew his granddaughter should have been home by now. He called her mobile phone, but she didn't answer. Recognizing this behavior as entirely out of character, he rushed to the police station to report her disappearance. However, the officers dismissed his concerns, attributing Louisa's absence to a potential romantic involvement. Left with no choice, Louisa's family started searching for her themselves, and her classmates spread information about her disappearance on social media. The next day, an unidentified man called Louisa's grandfather, assuring him that Louisa was fine but didn't want to talk to him. He added that they were planning to go to Switzerland together. Not believing a word of the stranger's claim, the grandfather made multiple attempts to contact the police but received no assistance. Louisa's mother, Monica, traveled from the UK, where she had been living and working, and had somewhat better luck with the police. Only on the fourth day did the police begin an investigation which seemed more like mockery of the relatives. Louisa's grandfather was subjected to a polygraph test because they suspected him of withholding information. Finally, on May 30th, the case was handed over to the Directorate for Investigating Organized Crime and Terrorism, DCOT, which announced the opening of a criminal case on June 6th. They decided to investigate Louisa's disappearance as a human trafficking case, as they saw signs that she might have been recruited against her will for sexual exploitation. DCOT continued their investigation when news broke about the disappearance of another girl, Alexandra Masishanu. A 15-year-old teenager from Dobra, Slovenia, was a student in the 10th grade at one of the top schools in CARACAL. On July 24th, Alexandra left her home at 10 o'clock in the morning to meet a friend from CARACAL. No one else saw her after that. The girl's parents quickly turned to the police, but the officers did not take their concerns seriously, stating that she was old enough to go out with friends and lose track of time. They advised them to wait. When the truth about the two murders came to light, the criminal inaction and negligence of officials and law enforcement personnel triggered a massive political crisis in the country. Many government bodies tried to demonstrate their activity, showing that they were doing their job, but it did not help them. The Minister of the Interior, the head of the criminal police, the director of the rescue service, the police leadership, and the prosecution in CARACAL were all dismissed. The Prime Minister dismissed the Minister of Education, who cynically remarked that young girls should think twice before getting into strangers' cars, as if she were unaware of the problems with public transportation in the country and the fact that hitchhiking is sometimes the only way to travel in small towns. The police claimed that the Special Telecommunications Service employees could not provide more precise information about the origins of the calls, leading to their search efforts being focused in the wrong places. However, the police were also criticized for their slow and chaotic response. Frustrated, the grandfather of Louisa labeled them as criminals being paid by the government to not do their job. At the same time, questions arose about the remains of the murdered girls. Here is where the most significant mystery of this story begins. Gheorghe stated that he burned the bodies. He scattered fragments of Louisa's bones in the forest and disposed of her clothes. However, he did not have time to do the same with Alexandra's clothes and body. Investigators reconstructed the crime scenes. Gheorghe was asked to guide the investigators step by step to all the places he had been on the days of the deaths of Louisa and Alexandra. At this point, he started to contradict himself in his statements, allegedly struggling to remember what he did at the time. According to criminologists, Gheorghe intentionally led them on a wild goose chase. Although he confessed to the two murders he was asked about, when he was requested to repeat his actions during the crimes and show where he left the remains, he panicked. This might be because he probably had a secret location where he hid all his victims. As there were likely more than 2 bodies in that hidden place, he led the investigators on a wild goose chase, pretending to be confused, not understanding, and not remembering anything. Although fragments of bones were found in the forest, experts believed that the bodies were either in the Danube or the Olt River. In November 2019, while in prison, Gheorghe began to write a confession detailing what he had done to Luisa and Alexandra. He started his account with the incident on April 14th, when he stopped his car as Louise was hitchhiking on the road. He agreed to give her a ride and engaged in conversation with her during the journey. He realized that he was becoming sexually aroused. His thoughts were consumed by nothing else but fulfilling his own desires. The man offered the girl 30 Romanian lei, about $7, for intimate services. When she declined, he struck her in the face and bound her with a belt. Interestingly, Gheorghe also blindfolded her so that the victim wouldn't know the way to his house. Does this imply that he intended to release her alive? After parking the car at his house, the man noticed his 36-year-old neighbor, Stefan Repeziano, in the yard. Stefan occasionally helped Gheorghe clean up the yard. Seeing a beautiful young girl in the car, Stefan asked who she was. With no other option, Gheorghe said that he brought her for intimate services, and the neighbor asked to join him. Gheorghe agreed. The men subjected Louise to humiliation and continued to torment her for 4 days. On the morning of the 4th day, Gheorghe lost his temper when the girl tried to resist him for the last time. He violently beat her and left her in a pool of blood on the bed, briefly stepping out to feed otters. When he returned, it was already too late to help the girl. The man didn't panic. He placed her in a metallic barrel and set it on fire, covering it with plastic and cardboard. Then, he went to sleep. When he woke up, he collected the ashes and fragments of bones and scattered them along the border of the nearby forest. Gheorghe's account of what happened to Alexandra was even more sinister. On July 24th, 2 months after Louise's murder, he noticed the same girl hitchhiking on the road again. Even though he was driving in the opposite direction, he turned the car around and offered her a ride. The story repeated itself. He offered Alexandra 50 lei for intimate services, and upon her refusal, he abducted her. He brought the bound girl to his home, immediately tying her to the bed and subjecting her to violence. The next day, at 6 in the morning, Gheorghe was drinking coffee while his victim lay tied to the bed. The girl complained of a terrible headache and said she needed a painkiller. Gheorghe suggested going to buy some medication. Before leaving, he additionally tied her with ropes, wires, and a chain. In addition to the medication, he bought a prepaid card to call Alexandra's mother. Inserting it into the girl's mobile phone, he called her mother and claimed to be Alexandra's boyfriend, assuring her that everything was fine. Then he discarded the phone. The phone was later found, and some children played with it. The man returned home around noon. He saw that Alexandra had freed herself and was wandering around the house with his mobile phone. He struck her several times, causing her to fall and hit her head on the concrete floor, resulting in her death. The man wrapped the body in bedsheets, placed some wooden planks and chips, and a 2-liter bottle of Vaseline in a barrel and set it on fire. On top, he threw a thick cardboard. He also threw his mobile phone there. Then he went to sleep. He woke up early in the morning to the barking of dogs, as police were banging on his door. Despite the man's confession and the results of the DNA analysis, the families of Alexandra and Luisa refused to believe that Gheorghe killed the girls. And the matter was not only in the reluctance of the relatives to believe that they are no longer alive. In fact, there was reason to suspect Gheorghe of human trafficking and that the girls weren't killed but were sold for exploitation. First of all, in favor of this version is the fact that human trafficking is a very common phenomenon in Romania. Additionally, in 2022, Gheorghe recanted his confession. He confirmed that he kidnapped and mistreated Alexandra and Luisa, but then handed them over to a local criminal boss who sent the girls to a brothel in Turkey. The police allegedly protect this boss, so they tortured Gheorghe and forced him to take the blame for the murder, and they planted Alexandra's teeth themselves. The man's story seems far-fetched if it weren't for some facts. It's unclear why George didn't immediately try to dispose of Alexandra's body, knowing that she had called the police from his phone. Instead of that, he slowly cremated her body for a long 8 hours. Moreover, the burning of an entire human body should produce a very unpleasant smell and smoke. However, the man's neighbors didn't notice any smoke, smell, or anything unusual. The way Gheorghe behaved during the abductions shows that he knew step by step how to act. He knew how to select victims of a specific appearance, and the act of abduction itself seemed standardized. The series of potential crimes was only interrupted when Alexandra pulled him out of this familiar routine by calling the police. Furthermore, investigators speculated that Georga might have had accomplices. The point is, right after the girls' disappearances, unknown individuals called both families several times, assuring them that the girls were all right. At least 2 of these calls were made by Georga, but Alexandra's mother and Louisa's grandfather are convinced that 2 people were calling them. This argument that Georga might have had accomplices prompted not only Romanian police, but also the FBI, Eurojust, and Italy's main anti-mafia agency to get involved in the investigation. Additionally, it seemed to the relatives that the prosecution intentionally prolonged the case. In particular, the prosecutor received video material that indicated Georga's car was connected to Louisa's abduction, but the prosecutor never summoned him for questioning or ordered a search of his car or home. After Alexandra's disappearance until July 27th, he didn't share the surveillance camera footage, which captured Georga's car. Even then, he only showed them a single frame from the video, where the car's license plate wasn't visible. Also, on July 27th, after searching the man's house, another accuser not only claimed that Alexandra was killed on that night, but also that strangulation was the cause of her death. However, how could he know this without the victim's body? Georga hadn't made a confession yet. And finally, the most intriguing argument in favor of the possibility that the man might have been involved in human trafficking is that his daughter, Daniela Dinky, assured investigators and the media that she wanted nothing to do with her father and didn't communicate with him. But it turned out to be a lie. She did communicate with her father, and she has a criminal record herself. A few years ago, she was accused of connections to human trafficking networks. Following this, another revelation came in the story. Georga Dinka's son, Dan, was once involved in a group assault and escaped punishment only due to his father's intervention. Allegedly, Georga had connections within the police and the prosecutor's office. The victim was persuaded to withdraw her statement, and the case was kept confidential. Equally important in this case is the question of whether Georga's list of victims could be longer. 2 girls were abducted under similar circumstances when trying to hitchhike, and they resembled each other in appearance. This points to a characteristic modus operandi of the criminal, relying on chance and showing an interest in a specific type of appearance. The man's inclination to commit crimes might partly be explained by his suffering from antisocial personality disorder. This condition is characterized by a constant pursuit of pleasure and satisfaction, as well as a lack of empathy, respect for the feelings, needs, or suffering of others, and a lack of remorse after offending or causing harm to another person. Some individuals suffering from this condition cannot form close relationships and use dominance and intimidation to control others. In this context, all the elements of the puzzle come together to form a coherent picture, but what's surprising is Georga's age, 66 years old. Criminals with a similar diagnosis usually evolve into violent killers during their youth. This disorder remains with a person throughout their life and doesn't appear and then diminish like other mental disorders. In other words, it's rare for a man to suddenly kill 2 girls with a 2-month gap at the age of 66. Georga most likely committed other heinous crimes in the past. It's unlikely that Alexandra and Louise were his only victims. Very unlikely. Georga was charged with human trafficking, trafficking of minors, 2 cases of assault, 2 murders, and 2 cases of desecration of bodies. But he wasn't planning on surrendering so easily. Dubbed the CARACAL monster, he attempted to sue Romania in the European Court of Human Rights, pointing to a lack of evidence and claiming that he was treated unfairly during his arrest. He fought for a long time, but ultimately lost. On September 23rd, the 69-year-old Georga was sentenced to the maximum possible punishment, 30 years of imprisonment. The thing is, for all the charges brought against him, he should have received 108 years in prison. But for individuals over the age of 65, the maximum punishment is considered to be 30 years. He is also obligated to pay compensation of 700,000 euros to the victim's relatives. The neighbor of the man, Stefan Repeziano, was sentenced to 7 years in prison for his involvement in the violence. In March 2023, Georga once again caught the public's attention by declaring that he had repented and found God. He stated that he was able to forget and leave behind the entire ordeal. In contrast to him, the victim's relatives will never be able to forget what happened. Formerly cheerful and lively Rachel Berkheimer experienced a tragic loss that plunged her into the depths of despair and hopelessness. But just when she began to rediscover the joy of living, she fell into a trap cunningly laid by people who had sworn to love and protect her. How could it come to pass that an 18-year-old girl was horrified to witness people she trusted unreservedly digging her grave? Rachel Berkheimer's father jokes that he used to be an answering machine for his daughter. A sociable, active, and athletic girl, she easily made new friends and was the life of any gathering. Everything changed in August 2001 when Rachel was in her senior year at Everett High School in Everett, Washington. She was crushed by the loss of her 6 best friends in unrelated tragedies, ranging from drowning to accidents. One of these incidents completely broke Rachel when she lost her closest friend, Corey Haynes, in a terrible car accident. They weren't a couple, but they had been friends for many years. Bill Berkheimer, Rachel's father, explains they were like brother and sister to each other. Corey was an amazing young man. He knew her better than anyone else on earth. And after losing Corey, Rachel's life went downhill. She had difficulty concentrating, experienced depression, and had to see a psychologist. She transferred from Marysville-Pilchuck High School to an alternative educational institution and eventually dropped out altogether. She also quit her job at a local pizzeria. Corey's mother says that after the accident, Rachel often called her to check in. She loved leaving gifts, some sculptures for the garden or little angel statues on her doorstep. But the spark of happiness that had illuminated Rachel's life had now vanished. Parents, older sister, and friends all made many attempts to help Rachel. Unfortunately, they were all unsuccessful. "We witnessed a complete transformation in front of our eyes," recalls Megan Hoang, Rachel's sister. Rachel shut herself off from her entire family. Now she was living life in complete despair and started hanging out with a new group of guys who were very different from her previous circle. One of them, in particular, will have the most dramatic impact on her life. Rachel met 20-year-old John Anderson at a school party. Many advised her against befriending this guy. Anderson had been in jail several times and was a member of a poorly organized and diverse street gang. The gang was in its early stages and had a rather ridiculous name, the Northwest Mafia. The guys stole illicit substances, sold some of them, but mostly used them themselves. They had no other ambitions in life. They would get together to play video games and simply waste their lives. Rachel's father learned about Anderson's presence in his daughter's life when he received a $640 phone bill on a not-so-fine day. He looked at it and couldn't believe it was sent from the prison in Shelton, Washington. It turned out that John Anderson, once again, found himself behind bars and had called his daughter many times, as well as written her frighteningly obsessive letters. Bill was afraid for his daughter and immediately tried to talk to her. But she kept saying that she saw another side of John and that he wasn't as others perceived him to be. However, the smitten Rachel would soon receive a serious shock from the cruel reality. Anderson was dangerously jealous and domineering, to the extent that he would sniff Rachel's clothes and hair to find out if she had been with another guy. Megan saw bruises on Rachel and suspected that Anderson was capable of hitting her. Finally, Rachel had enough of this treatment and stopped answering her boyfriend's calls or reading his letters after several months. However, he wasn't planning to stop pursuing her. In letters from prison in December 2001, Anderson wrote that she was the best thing that ever happened to him. He asked her to give their relationship another chance and even mentioned marriage. "You are my world, my everything. You make my heart beat, and you make me act and think," he wrote. "I don't think I can or ever want to live without your love." Meanwhile, he became increasingly irritable and angry when she didn't respond. In the opinion of the girl's father, Anderson was particularly annoyed that Rachel was one of the few people he couldn't control. Rachel found herself trapped in a volatile relationship with Anderson, sometimes leaving him and then starting all over again. But her father doesn't think that it was only jealousy that led to what happened next. John Anderson believed that the love of his life was trying to lure him into a trap, so he decided to punish her. Several weeks before the tragedy, the girl tried to get her life back on track. Rachel's father will never forget the day she sat on the steps of their home and talked about finishing school and starting to study medicine. She was glowing, Bill recalls. And then she confessed to her father that she had met a new friend who encouraged her to return to school. They were planning to finish school together, celebrate graduation, and start over. Her new friend's name was Maurice Rivas, who would confess to her murder 2 months later. Maurice Rivas, also a member of John Anderson's gang, wanted to break ties with his old friends. Maurice was 18 and had grown up in a disadvantaged family, but he and Rachel quickly became friends because they were united by a desire to escape the empty, aimless life preferred by the gang. However, this was easier said than done. Neither the gang nor John Anderson were willing to give up what they believed belonged to them so easily. At the time of yet another breakup with John, Rachel began dating one of his best friends, J.J. Braswell, naively assuming that Anderson would swallow such an affront. Suspicions within the gang were fueled by the belief that Rachel was passing on their secrets to her acquaintances, including some of Anderson's rivals. Besides the Northwest Mafia, there were at least 2 other groups of dealers and former associates operating in the region that the gang did not approve of. Rachel maintained a friendly demeanor with all of them, making the Anderson group increasingly nervous. It's no wonder that at some point, someone hinted to the girl that she was in danger. Rachel was frightened and sought advice from her older sister Megan. She advised Rachel to stay away from Anderson, but didn't believe he could really be dangerous. Deciding not to let the situation slide, on the evening of September 23, 2002, Rachel attended a gathering at the home of one of the gang members, 32-year-old Yusef Jihad. However, it wasn't exactly a typical party, just a few idlers gathering together as they often did before. Rachel went to Yusef's house with the intention of convincing her friends that she hadn't betrayed them and that they could trust her. Additionally, she felt safe in the company of Maurice, who also hadn't managed to sever ties with the gang. All the guys were sitting on the couch, chatting and laughing, when John Anderson walked into the house. Without much ado, he drew his weapon. Rachel got scared, jumped up and tried to run out of the house, but he intercepted her right at the door. Rachel fell into John Anderson's and his friends' cunning trap, and the nightmare of that night was only just beginning. Anderson grabbed the girl by her hair, hit her in the face, knocked her down, and began to beat her. 2 other guys didn't hesitate to help him. Someone turned up the music to drown out Rachel's screams. After the beating, they took Rachel to the garage, not forgetting to gag her and tie her up with adhesive tape so she couldn't call for help. After throwing the girl on the garage floor, they went to discuss what to do with her next. The gang members considered taking advantage of her vulnerability or demanding a ransom from her parents. Apparently, the guys had planned the trap, but they hadn't figured out what to do with the captive next. Unable to make such a difficult decision, they ate pizza and played video games while the girl lay on the garage floor in horror, writhing in pain. Suddenly, a ray of hope flashed before the poor girl when the homeowner and Yusef's girlfriend, Trissa Connor, returned home. Trissa walked into the house through the garage, saw Rachel bound, beaten, lying on the floor, and quietly made her way to the kitchen to get a knife and free the girl. But Anderson noticed it and thwarted Trissa's attempt to free Rachel. Trissa threatened to call the police if the guys didn't remove the girl from her garage. Unfortunately, she never contacted the police, and the flustered gang members had to stuff the captive into a black bag, which they then stuffed into the Jeep. Later, Trissa would claim that she didn't dial 911 because she was afraid for her life and the life of her daughter. The guys didn't know what to do with the girl next. They even discussed the idea of renting a hotel room where she could heal her wounds and then letting her go. But that was not meant to happen. 4 guys, including Rachel's ex-boyfriend, John Anderson, and her best friend Maurice, who had promised to protect her, drove 50 kilometers to the nearest field in the foothills of the Cascade Mountains. They decided that Rachel was Anderson's problem and that he would have to deal with her. Anderson and the other 2 guys went for shovels, while Maurice was ordered to watch the captive. As Maurice later confessed, he hesitated to open the bag in which Rachel was placed. The girl realized she was going to die and begged for it not to be drowning. In response to her plea, Maurice stated that he doubted it would go that far. If Maurice had the desire or opportunity to save the girl, he didn't take that chance. When the rest of the gang returned, the abuse and humiliation continued. Rachel made noise when the guys started taking shovels out of the Jeep. Anderson then took a shovel and struck the bag with all his might. The guys callously dug a grave for the girl with whom they had been joking and laughing just a few hours ago. Anderson and his accomplices pulled her out of the bag and started tearing off her clothes. But Rachel had enough self-respect to demand that she do it herself. Undressing and removing all her rings and necklace, she begged to be allowed to keep 1 ring, a gift from a close friend who had died in a car accident. But Anderson lacked the mercy to grant even this last request. The friends ordered the girl to kneel face down in the pit. Rachel knelt down for a short prayer. Seeing this, Anderson mockingly advised her not to worry about it, because she would soon meet him personally. Soon, Rachel's torment ended when she died from the bullets fired from her ex-boyfriend John Anderson's weapon. After emptying the entire magazine, the gang members buried the pit and calmly drove away. They didn't forget to drive the girl's car to her ex-boyfriend's house to frame an innocent person. No one in the town knew what had happened to Rachel apart from the members of the gang. Everyone believed that the girl had disappeared, and her search began almost immediately. She was searched for several days until a breakthrough occurred in the case. The police received a valuable tip from the mother of one of the gang members, Jeffrey Barth. In a conversation with Detective Scott Fenter, the woman mentioned that the guys almost always rode in a red Jeep owned by 17-year-old Matthew Durham. Initially, Matthew resisted, but not being a seasoned offender, he couldn't withstand the pressure of experienced investigators for long. The teenager agreed to show the police the place where the girl was killed. 10 days after the crime, Rachel's body was found. Matthew no longer resisted and named all his friends who were at the girl's grave that night. This led the police, with a search warrant, to the house where Rachel's nightmare began. In a pond, along with the adhesive tape and the girl's jewelry, including her favorite ring that she asked to be left with her, the murder weapon was found. Forensic examination confirmed that the bullets that killed the girl were fired from this weapon. Additionally, the police found clothing in the house that the criminals had tried to burn, and even the shovel they used to dig the grave for Rachel. One after another, law enforcement authorities built cases against 8 suspects who shifted blame for the crime onto each other just to get away with lesser punishment. 5 of the suspects agreed to deals and shorter sentences in exchange for testimony in court against Anderson, 22-year-old John Whitaker, who helped dig the pit, and Yusuf, who was involved in planning the crime. In court, Morris recounted that shortly before Rachel's murder, she invited Yusuf and Anderson to a motel for a party. Anderson was busy, so Yusuf went to the motel with Whitaker. Perhaps Rachel just wanted to talk and justify herself in their eyes, but they grew suspicious when they saw familiar cars in the parking lot and movements behind the curtains in room 1. It was as if someone was watching them from a window, and the guys thought Rachel had conspired with a rival gang and lured them into a trap to be robbed or even killed. Witnesses at the trial indicated that Anderson's group was nervous because Rachel saw no harm in interacting with people who were disliked by the Northwest Mafia. One of the gang members warned her a few days before the murder that she needed to choose a side. The invitation to the motel only heightened tensions and raised further suspicions that she was working against them. There were even concerns that she might inform the police, so they planned a trap for her. On September 23rd, Maurice and Matthew invited Rachel to the house of 16-year-old Nathan Lovelace. Anderson and 2 other gang leaders planned to drive to the garage, wait for her arrival, and grab her. However, things did not go as planned when Nathan's father unexpectedly returned home. Anderson then ordered Matthew to take the girl to Yusuf's house, threatening him with punishment if he failed. The second attempt was more successful, and the girl was beaten, abducted, and eventually killed by her ex-boyfriend and her new friend. Maurice later confessed that he did not help or keep his promise to protect Rachel because he feared for his own life. As painful as it was for Rachel's relatives, they had to be present at every trial of the 8 criminals and repeatedly come face to face with her murderers. The defendants behaved despicably in court, and Anderson was the worst of them all. He mocked, recalls Rachel's sister. He showed no signs of remorse, smiled at the camera, and even allowed himself to turn and wink at us. John Anderson and John Whitaker were sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The gang leader Yusuf will spend 37 years in prison, while Maurice and Matthew will serve 25 years and 10 months. The other participants in the crime served no more than 10 years in prison. Each person involved in the abduction and murder had the opportunity to help Rachel, but they all failed her. It was a senseless and merciless killing of a girl by 8 heartless traitors who, intoxicated by rage and revenge, took an innocent life and condemned the family to endless mourning. It is not satisfaction, not victory. It is simply the end of the trial, admitted Bill Berkheimer after the trial. I will never forget the photo of the grave after they removed her body, and in the soil was a perfectly preserved imprint of her hands folded in prayer. And that is what gives me some kind of solace, he added.